One of my favorite pastimes of the past year has been poker, Texas Hold'em specifically. I'm not a natural strategic mastermind, like my wife, when it comes to strategy games of any sort. Texas Hold'em is no exception. Over the past year, I've been learning how to play poker from six-time World Series champion Daniel Negreanu. Negreanu is one of many renowned experts that Masterclass has to teach you how to do what's important to you. I've been watching Negreanu's nearly 30 lessons on poker, embedded with many of his examples from TV tournaments spliced in. Daniel Negreanu's Masterclass on Texas Hold'em has really helped me grow fundamentally sound at Texas Hold'em. There are hundreds of other experts who can help you grow various professional skills or your abilities in various hobbies. Check out Masterclass today using my link in the show notes. If you treat yourself to Masterclass using that link, you'll also be supporting the show. Now, onto our show.
This is Forgotten Wars.
A British MP delivered a speech in the Welsh town of Bangor on April 11th, 1900, to a hall that was crowded both inside and out. Outside the hall, angry mobs sang patriotic songs while police tried to keep order. This British MP had opposed war with the Boer republics from the beginning. He continued to forcefully denounce this war for an hour while mobs outside shattered windows of this Bangor building. He had many criticisms. Some of them were arguably a little too sweeping, but many of them rang true and rang rhetorically strong. Among many other arguments, he stated that £60 million and 4,000 Britons' lives had already been spent on this war. The money could have been spent to give every elderly man in Britain a pension. Thousands of Boers were being wiped out, and they had much less people to lose. On his way out of the hall, a man from the crowd emerged and swung a stick with all his might, striking the brash MP in the head, leaving the MP dazed for a few seconds. The MP was whisked away to hide out in a nearby cafe until it was safe to re-emerge. And re-emerge David Lloyd George did on April 24th in another Welsh town, to speak words that rang partially true. Quote, "We're embarking on a war of annexation, which might become a war of extermination. Where is that war, which is costing between £6 and £8 million a month, going to end? We cannot exterminate the Boers, and when Pretoria has been captured, it will take 50,000 troops to occupy the two republics." End quote.
Under the British flag, you will have everything you desire, but that flag will continue to fly over the land.
Over the land, maybe. Over the people, never. You will see me in the field, fighting for our independence, long after you and your party who make war with your mouths have fled the country.
I don't think the Boers will have a chance.
Disarm your blacks. Active part of a white man in a white man's war.
Civilized war is awful.
Colonel Charles Caldwell wrote the book Small Wars, Their Principles and Practice in 1896. Colonel Caldwell made many analogies to previous wars, previous asymmetric encounters, to instruct military leaders on how to conduct irregular warfare. He argued that to win an irregular war, the British sometimes would have to use methods that may, quote, shock the humanitarian. British military academics at the time had to read Caldwell's Small Wars. But this book didn't stay solely academic. When Caldwell himself led a mobile column during the Anglo-Boer War, he put his book's theories to work as he burned down Boer farms in the Transvaal. One Private Bowers recounted something that was all too common still in October of 1900 as British scorched earth tactics continued. Quote, We sat down and had a nice song round the piano. Then we just piled up the furniture and set fire to the farm. All columns were doing it. The idea was to starve the Boers out." End quote. Members of the British Army, like Private Bowers, destroyed 30,000 homes and left dozens of towns in ashes. Some soldiers stole ovens from families. Others bayoneted pigs for some nice meat later on. Some sadistic soldiers even took pleasure in burning a herd of sheep alive. Some families had time to pack their necessities. Some women bolted back into burning homes to grab necessities. Some families had to drag wagons with their loaded belongings by hand because their animals had been shot. African homes often weren't spared either, with the familiar logic being that if the Brits didn't burn it down, the Boers would rob the Africans not willing to supply them. When reports of farm burning filtered back to Britain, members of Parliament began to grill the War Office. The War Office at first just denied that farm burning was happening. As activists and Liberal MPs continued to press the Salisbury cabinet, the always honest Secretary of State for Colonies, Joseph Chamberlain, maintained that no British soldiers could be slandered, that this farm burning thing was being totally exaggerated, that the few farms being burned were those of civilians who evidently were cooperating with the Boer warriors, and that the government would be foolish to handicap the military in this war. Later that year, the S word was dropped. Just a couple months after getting attacked outside a Welsh meeting hall, MP David Lloyd George had more to say in July. The British were doing what the Spanish had done to Cuba just a couple years before. Quote, "This war will brutalize the people, and the savagery which must necessarily follow will stain the name of this country." End quote. I wish I could tell you listeners that history would prove Lloyd George wrong. Months after Lloyd George's remarks, MP Samuel Smith alluded to Spanish General Weyler, saying the British were committing atrocities approaching Weyler's magnitude. Smith said, quote, "We are storing up for ourselves a heritage of hatred to last for generations. Future historians would look upon our present action as one of the most deplorable blunders that this country had ever made." End quote. Some British newspapers took a different position. For example, the Pall Mall Gazette recommended that they send war captives to St. Helena or Ceylon. The government used a familiar 20th century weapon, propaganda. They hired celebrity writers like Rudyard Kipling, like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, to promote the war. After volunteering at a hospital in Bloemfontein and writing his account of the war's first phase, Doyle defended British scorched earth tactics in his second book on the war, released in 1902. But citizens still continued to write British newspapers predicting that the same starvation and epidemics that hit Cubans in reconcentration camps would hit Boers if scorched earth tactics and concentration camps were embraced. Some British officers looked at a future beyond the war and worried that this scorched earth policy would keep commandos in the field longer. One officer wrote, quote, "The burgher out on the commando is bound always to his farm. By burning it and sending his family packing, we are only making him a roving desperado, consumed with hatred." British Captain Francis-Fletcher-Vane wrote at the end of the war, quote, "If farms had not been burnt, the war would have been sooner over." On August 14th, 1900, Lord Roberts proclaimed that any Boers who hadn't sworn neutrality would be detained as POWs. Boer families who didn't inform British of hostile elements would be considered guilty of cooperating with the Boers. By September, the British started taking as POWs any males of military age that were encountered near active commandos, whether those males were serving in the commando or not. What the British government called refugee camps began to emerge in September 1900. Lord Roberts and company placed those Boers who'd voluntarily laid down their arms into 2 of these camps, in Pretoria and in Bloemfontein, to protect those surrendered Boers from being pulled back into commandos or harmed by other Boers. But after Lord Roberts and company determined that just dumping Boer women and children refugees near commandos wasn't really working, Lord Roberts and company siphoned these women and children into the refugee camps as well. These undesirables, these women, children, and old men who'd watched their homes go up in flames, soon outnumbered the original refugees. The British tried to paint these camps as necessary to protect Boers from starvation and from African natives, from sexual savagery of the black man towards the white woman. The generalKelly-kenney you've heard of in previous episodes argued early for concentration camps. Kitchener argued to Secretary Broderick in December 1900 that, quote, every farm is an intelligence agency and supply depot, so that it is impossible to surround or catch the enemy. Writing in 1901, Kitchener said that, quote, women left in farms give complete intelligence to the Boers of all our movements and feed the commandos in the neighborhood. Kitchener and Roberts saw the camps as hostage sites that could pressure men into leaving their commandos so that they could reunite with their families trapped in these camps. The British command had some experience building camps for separating people. While managing India, they'd built famine camps for Indians displaced and marginalized during famines that broke out in the 1870s and the 1890s. What's more, the British built plague camps in response to the bubonic plague striking parts of India from 1896 to 1897. 2 British officers who used their experience managing camps in India while in southern Africa were Captain Trollope, Chief Superintendent of the Orange River Colony's camps, and Major de Lotbiniere, Director of Camps for Native Africans. The months ahead would prove whether their experience had any value. One woman would do more to deliver a verdict on these refugee camps than anyone in the world. Pakenham writes about this perpetually single 41-year-old woman from the English town of Cornwall who lived with her invalid father. Then, Pakenham writes, quote, her first taste of freedom came at 35, when she vanished into the wilds of Minnesota, where she labored to convert Cornish miners to temperance. Then she went back to England after being jilted by a fiancé in Mexico, just as the war clouds gathered. Her political patron was her uncle, Lord Hobhouse, a distinguished liberal of the old school and a friend of the pro-Boers. So it was natural that she would fling herself, head and heart, into the work of the Pro-Boers Relief Fund, the South African Women and Children Distress Fund. She organized a women's protest against the war. Many British saw her as a traitor. At a Quaker-organized meeting in July, she and the other speakers had to dodge some hostile audience that rushed the stage and chairs that audience had thrown just before. But Emily Hobhouse would not be shaken. She soon told her family the plan to personally distribute the money from the distress fund by traveling to South Africa. Emily's brother worried that she would get slandered in England or catch a disease from those wars. Emily's reply, quote, life has no attractions, death a good many, so the argument has no weight. She sailed in second class for the Cape of Good Hope that December of 1900. She wrote 4 days after landing in Cape Town of a soldier who claimed to have burned down 600 farms himself, and about 8-year-old boys being taken as if they were captured soldiers. She would just have to see these things for herself. She managed to reach Sir Alfred Milner. She made many requests and reported on at least 11 camps she'd already heard of. When she demanded one vehicle to transport food and another to transport clothes, Milner explained that she could not go to any camp without Lord Kitchener's permission. You see, Lord Roberts had thought the war was virtually over. So Lord Roberts placed his South African command fully into Lord Kitchener's hands and accepted Sir Garnet Wolseley's position as Commander-in-Chief at the War Office in late November. Kitchener, by the way, likes using these war camps for retribution, to pay back the Boers for their continued resistance. He argued that wives of men who still insisted on resisting the British, quote, forfeited their right to considerate treatment. Kitchener intentionally transferred thousands of Boer families to camps far away from their homes. But back to Hobhouse. As instructed, Emily Hobhouse made her requests to Kitchener. Lord Kitchener allowed her to travel as far as Bloemfontein with one truck, but no interpreter. Hobhouse took a train and eventually saw her first concentration camp 2 miles outside Bloemfontein. In the blazing veldt lay rows of round tents. Each family at the camp got one tent. In the future, the camp would get so crowded that new arrivals had to sleep in wagons or railway carriages. Not a single chair available in camp meant that Hobhouse and one of her first Boer interviewees had to roll up blankets to use as stools. The two women spoke as flies buzzed inside and outside the tent, transforming anything on the floor into black carpets. While they spoke, a deadly, poisonous puff adder snake crept under the tent wall. Hobhouse struck at the snake with her umbrella until someone else struck a death blow to the snake with a mallet. Hobhouse met another woman who had been separated from her husband and her 5 children. The woman carried a 6th child, but she still had to sleep on the ground in the last weeks of pregnancy. Hobhouse reported this was all too normal. The more Hobhouse interviewed refugees and prisoners, the more she learned of water shortages, the absence of soap, the spread of measles, children with typhoid, husbands shipped away to Ceylon as punishment, corpses remaining in tents long enough to rot. This camp had about 2,000 residents, with half of them being children. Hobhouse believed the head of the camp wanted to make life bearable. But Hobhouse also said, quote, do what you will, you can't undo the thing itself which is odious. To keep these camps going is murder to children. Hobhouse called for trained nurses and for river water to be boiled to stop the raging typhoid epidemic. Many British soldiers and officials thought her a fool or resented her for being a traitor. A new, much less friendly captain took charge of the camp and sought to monitor Hobhouse much more, despite her making a scene about his surveillance that she wouldn't accept unless it came on direct orders from Sir Alfred Milner. The captain ignored her when she demanded milk for malnourished children or for something to be done about children who were dying. She wanted to punch him. When a censor refused to approve her letter describing the wretched camp conditions, she waited for someone else she could smuggle her letters with. Hobhouse heard of dozens of camps. She wanted to see them all with her own eyes. All the while, Hobhouse felt ostracized and unattractive, and self-conscious as she spoke broken Dutch with camp residents. As she traveled to other camps, she rarely sat in a comfortable place on a train and rarely knew where she would sleep next. She spent one night on the floor in a borrowed room of a hotel inside a circle of bug repellent. She consumed nothing but jam and cocoa many days in a row. Hobhouse was happy to see that conditions at the Aliwal North and Norval's Pont camps weren't as crowded and the water much cleaner, but the tents grew so hot in the South African summer that it was useless to even test for fevers. The tent temperatures reached 110 degrees. The head of the Norval Pont camp ignored condemnation and bought clothes for refugees who needed them. The Aliwal North camp's leader tried to demilitarize the camp by not posting any camp guards and by allowing the camp residents and nearby town residents to mix freely. He provided more food rations and larger families got a second tent. The town had created a committee before to prepare for the over 2,000 detainees to fill the camp. Hobhouse still had to buy soap and supply that to the camp, and wondered how the Boers could be accused of being filthy when they weren't initially provided with anything for hygiene. When Hobhouse made it back to Bloemfontein, she demanded changes that would at least bring its camps up to par with Alival North and Norvalspont. When the concentration camps began being turned over to civilian rather than military administration, the British Army didn't provide nurses anymore. Hobhouse wasn't impressed by the nurses who did travel from the Cape to Bloemfontein, and the nurses weren't well supplied regardless. Hobhouse resented that the British called these camps refugee camps. She argued the British intentionally made the camp inmates homeless as part of their war strategy and treated the inmates like POWs. She believed the recent Hague Convention bound the British government to take care of its POWs. Hobhouse resented the British soldiers she saw trading and selling sewing machines, chairs, jewelry, and other items they looted from homes they burned down. Such a bitter irony to see these items being sold to camp detainees. Imagine having to buy back something a soldier stole from your home or your neighbor's home. Meanwhile, mostly children still died daily. The dead children were transferred at dawn, not through Bloemfontein, but around the town to a mass grave where they were deposited. Hobhouse saw another camp in Springfontein where Boers lived without shoes, socks, even underwear. The camp residents got meat, grain, and coffee, but hardly any coal, which is a huge problem if you're trying to consume meat, grain, and coffee. Through the transition from military to civilian leadership of camps, Hobhouse did start to see one awful practice start to dissipate: the providing of reduced rations to families who had relatives still fighting in a commando. Hobhouse later traveled to Kimberley and asked General Pretorius for permission to work in Kimberley and for a return pass to Bloemfontein. At this request, General Pretorius made an argument I find despicable, but that Hobhouse also found all too familiar. Maybe if these Boer families weren't so unsanitary and didn't use stupid folk remedies, their children wouldn't be dying in droves at these camps. Hobhouse angrily retorted that maybe having to sleep on the ground when you have measles and not having any doctors around with pediatric experience has more to do with these Boer children dying in droves. Petty Pretorius instead sent Hobhouse to Cape Town with the hope that she could turn around from there. She did turn around from Cape Town and got as far as Mafeking's concentration camp. One thing that really stuck with Hobhouse, though, was when she watched the clearing of the town of Warrenton. Here, Hobhouse watched in horror as women were herded into open coal trucks and sent away from their homes. Pritzker recounts the following statement by Hobhouse, quote, "Flocks and herds of frightened animals bellowing and baying for food and drink, tangled up with wagons and vehicles of all sorts, and dense crowds of human beings, combined to give a picture of war in all its destructiveness, cruelty, stupidity, and nakedness." When Hobhouse got back to Bloemfontein, the camp population had doubled from 2,000 to 4,000. She heard rumors of maggoty food and Boers going for days without food at various camps. Sir Alfred Milner refused again to let Hobhouse go further north, to observe the Transvaal camps. She could only wonder what she wasn't being allowed to see. After 4 months in southern Africa, Hobhouse knew full well that her relief funds aid barely exceeded a drop in the ocean, a drop into an ocean of humanity that overwhelmed these concentration camps. She believed her only chance to improve camp life was to go raise hell in England. So she headed back to Cape Town on May 1st, 1901. She stopped in Springfield on the way to see some of the same war refugees at the train station before. They still hadn't been placed in a camp. She saw a mother sitting against a wall with a covering pulled diagonally down from the wall. Hobhouse sat with the mother while the mother helplessly watched her malnourished baby die. Hobhouse so happened to find space on a ship carrying Sir Alfred Milner, soon to be Lord Milner, back to England. But there were several camps that Hobhouse did not have to travel hundreds of miles to see or overcome military prohibitions to see. She simply refused to see them. Many of you sadly can probably guess which camps I'm talking about. Another camp, housing 500 residents, sat on the edge of Bloemfontein. Hobhouse did tell the local ladies' league to look into this other camp. Hobhouse wrote to her aunt in March 1901, wondering if the British knew about these sorts of camps. Hobhouse reported hearing that lots of sickness and death reigned in these camps, and that the Quakers or the Aborigines Protection Society or somebody should look into these camps. But Hobhouse wrote, quote, "I cannot possibly pay any attention to them myself." When Alfred Milner accepted his appointment as South Africa's High Commissioner and the Cape Colony's governor in 1897, he spoke of his two most important goals. First, he wanted Boers and Brits to have good relations again. Second, he wanted to protect African natives from oppression. But before the Boer War even broke out, Milner decided, quote, "You have only to sacrifice the nigger" to achieve the first goal of reconciling Boers and Brits. When black Africans initially fled to British refugee camps, they initially were trying to flee Boer raids. Before long, though, British soldiers lit up black homes and farms, too. At first, the British placed blacks in the same camps as Boers. As more black and white refugees sought shelter, the British started establishing separate camps for blacks, eventually administered by the Native Refugee Department. Blacks who didn't walk into these camps took their chances hiding on the veldt, served some role in a Boer commando, or acted as servants in Boer camps. Black men who did end up in these camps had to work in some sort of support role for the British military if those men wanted any shot at their families surviving in the camp. By April 1902, some 13,000 blacks worked for the British military around these camps. Some black camps had fields nearby that the blacks could work and keep about 2/3 of the crop yields to feed themselves. The other third went to feeding the British military. These black camps didn't get tents. They just had to make do with whatever scraps lay around or mud that they could muster. With few exceptions, blacks did not get free rations like the Boers. The male head of a household had to work for any food for his family. Since British administrators decided that blacks had different nutritional needs, blacks got half the food rations of Boers. Go figure. The British administrators spread rumors of great gratitude blacks showed for the opportunity to earn money and have shelter. But missionaries who made their way onto these camps painted a very different picture, much like missionaries who would work in the Herero camps a couple years later. Reverend W.H.R. Brown wrote of the plight of these black refugees, saying, quote, "They are in great poverty and misery. Many are dying from day to day. What is to become of the survivors, I cannot think." Pitzer reports some more heartbreaking details about these black concentration camps. Quote, "One early report from Heidelberg reported that camp residents had nothing to eat but the corpses of diseased cattle. In another black camp, residents managed to raise pigs and sow a crop, only to watch British troops trample the field and seize their animals. The loss completely ruined the holdings of some 600 Africans in the camp," an official report noted. But the natives themselves admitted such losses were incidental in wartime. Those in black camps found themselves likewise tormented by Boers on commando duty. Night raids at Potchefstroom and Tai Bosch led to the death of one native, as well as the loss of money and clothes, along with hundreds of cattle and sheep. In response, the British armed squads of pickets, blacks from camp, to stand guard. Despite an incident in which guerrillas shot 13 picketers, as well as worries that arming natives would only provoke new raids and bloodshed. 850 black Africans served as armed guards in black concentration camps. Trench latrines and overcrowding led to filth and disease. Dysentery, typhoid, chickenpox, measles, and pneumonia afflicted the refugees. At Victoria Neck, the doctor refused to visit the camp, demanding that invalids see him in town. Many camps had no hospital and no nurses. When typhoid swept through these communities, no effort was made to quarantine the sufferers, despite the highly contagious nature of the disease. As with Boer mothers, black mothers got the brunt of blame when their children died, with one inspector suggesting that they were eating food meant for their sick offspring. Natives, he wrote, do not seem to care for their children until they reach a useful age. Solid work, man. As a new father, I can't imagine being blamed for having to helplessly watch my son starve because of a sick system like this. It's deeply depressing. About 115,000 blacks wound up in these concentration camps, camps that the British military managed for the whole of their existence. Missionaries tried to raise awareness about these camps, but could not get the attention or the funds to fix anything systematically. The superintendent for Native Affairs in the Orange River Colony wrote to London about high death rates in November 1901, but didn't think the rates were excessive. The next month, the death rates hit a new record and reached higher heights than death rates in Boer concentration camps. Of those 115,000 blacks who lived in about 70 concentration camps, there are 14,000 we know of who died. Historian Elizabeth van Heiningen also says that most official records of the camps were destroyed. So we will never know how many more blacks died in these death camps, or refugee camps. We do know that according to official reports, blacks died in their camps at rates at least 15% higher than Boers did in their concentration camps. Meanwhile, in British Parliament, Liberal MPs attacked British war policy and cast doubt on official reports about British refugee camps. They pointed to other reliable sources that painted a very different picture than the official British reports. These liberals even disputed the names for these camps. Camp proponents called them refugee camps, while opponents referred to them as camps of detention, and the residents as reconcentrados, alluding back to Cubans who suffered under Spanish camps. David Lloyd George remarked, quote, "There is no greater delusion in the mind of any man than to apply the term refugee to these camps. They are not refugee camps. They are camps of concentration, formed by the military as the result of military operations in the field." Lloyd George warned early in 1901 that the British risked other European powers intervening in this war the way some had when the British lost its American colonies. Prime Minister Salisbury retorted that the Boers should have thought of what would happen before invading Natal and the Cape Colony. The skeptics also cited Emily Hobhouse's letters as evidence of something dark going on in these camps. They also wondered aloud why the British administrators in southern Africa wouldn't let Hobhouse see the camps further north. When Hobhouse made it back to Britain to report her findings, many praised her work. One paper said that Hobhouse had, quote, "turned the light of day upon a hell of suffering deliberately created for expediting a policy of conquest," end quote. Hobhouse's reports compelled the War Office to at least make noises about considering her recommendations. More noise was made abroad about British policy in southern Africa. For example, a Swiss political cartoon paired British Secretary of State for the Colonies Joseph Chamberlain with King Herod, the genocidal king mentioned in the Christian Gospels. They were paired as partners in baby killing in the cartoon. But in the cartoon, Chamberlain looks down on Herod for taking a bumbling, less effective baby-killing approach. One British satirist suggested a new military decoration for this war of arson. Why not award some soldiers the Order of the Torch? Leader of the Liberal Party at the time, Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, made the following remark in a June 14th speech in London, quote, "When is a war not a war? When it is carried on by methods of barbarism in South Africa." End quote. Lloyd George attacked the Salisbury government again 3 days after Campbell Bannerman's methods of barbarism remark. Lloyd George accused the government of attempting an indirect policy of extermination against women and children. Quote, "I say that this is the result of a deliberate and settled policy. It is not a thing which has been done in 24 hours, for it has taken months and months to do it. The military authorities knew perfectly well it was to be done, and they had ample time to provide for it. They started clearing the country about 6 months ago, and it is disgraceful that 5 or 6 months after that, children should be dying at the rate of hundreds per month." End quote. Why attack women and children when men were their enemies? These barbarous methods would only lengthen the war. Quote, "We want to make loyal British subjects of these people. Is this the way to do it? Brave men will forget injuries to themselves much more readily than they will insults, indignities, and wrongs to their women and children. When children are treated this way and dying, we are simply ranging the deepest passions of the human heart against British rule in Africa. It will always be remembered that this is the way British rule started there, and this is the method by which it was brought about." End quote. But all this liberal rhetoric could not get the conservative government replaced. When a vote was called, 149 voted in favor of Lloyd George's motion, while 252 stood behind the Salisbury government. On a smaller scale, some also ripped into the War Office and British Cabinet for their management of the black concentration camps. For example, the pilot wrote, quote, "This was the war of humanity that was to lift the war yoke from the neck of the blacks. Yet, the blacks are dying faster in our camps than both Boers and British combined in the field." This was no exaggeration, by the way. If we are not to be disgraced forever, the thing must stop. End quote. Bowing to mounting pressure to address the British concentration camps, the War Office appointed a ladies' commission, also known as the Fawcett Commission, to visit the camps. They made damn sure not to include Hobhouse on this committee. So Hobhouse decided she would take matters into her own hands again and sail for Cape Town on October 5th, 1901. This time to work with those deported to coastal towns. Milner and Chamberlain, for that matter, remained queasy about these concentration camps and punishing women and children for the fight of commandos. But Milner and Kitchener would take no chances. They wouldn't allow Hobhouse ashore this time. Then Hobhouse got sick aboard her ship. When nurses from Cape Town came to inspect her, Hobhouse worked enough magic to get these nurses to return without inspecting her. The Cape Colony's medical officer would not be denied, though. He had Hobhouse carried off the ship and placed on the next passenger liner to England. However, the British government didn't get off easy when the Ladies' Committee presented their eyewitness accounts in December. The Fawcett Committee had witnessed women having to wash their clothes in water contaminated by shit at the Mafeking camp. That camp's callous supervisor ignored their recommendations for preventing a typhoid outbreak, and months later presided over an outbreak that killed 400 people per month. So I'm sure many of these women who originally arrived, predisposed to give the British the benefit of the doubt, because they did believe the war itself was just, left southern Africa ready to unload some righteous anger on the powers that were. They raked the government over the coals for mortality rates that had increased since Hobhouse had visited the first time. They made recommendations consistent with Emily Hobhouse's and went even further. They demanded nurses, increased food rations, more coal rations, wood for makeshift beds, water boilers for purifying drinking water, and vegetables. The Fawcett Committee decried the suggestion that these deaths were out of the British administration's control. But this committee definitely criticized the hygiene of Boer mothers too, when compared to, quote, intelligent and careful British parents they met on their trip. Regardless of any prejudices these committee members had, they were sure about one thing, quote, it is a huge object lesson to the world in what not to do. For if the children had not been so massed together, the death rate from those terrible infectious diseases would not have been so great. We brought the women in to stop them from helping their husbands in the war, and by doing so, we have undoubtedly killed them in thousands, as much as if we had shot them on our own doorsteps. And anyone but a British general would have realized this long ago. End quote. Historian Peter Warwick notes that when the South African War of 1899 to 1902 finally finished, about twice as many people died in these concentration camps as all men who died in battle. More than 100,000 Boers sent to concentration camps, and roughly the same number of blacks sent to concentration camps. About 10% of the southern African population was wiped out in these camps. About 28,000 Boers died in these camps. Why did so many Boers die in these camps? Fransjohan Pretorius sums it up like this, quote, first, the war had inevitably brought unhygienic conditions, and pollution of air, water, and soil were sources of disease. Second, the unhygienic habits of some inmates and their backwardness and superstition, added by a stubborn refusal to undergo hospital treatment, contributed to their deaths. The third and most important reason was poor camp administration. End quote. We will never know how many blacks actually died in their camps, but it was likely at least 20,000. About 80% of those who died in these camps were children. Most of those died from completely avoidable outbreaks of the measles and typhoid fever. People still argue today about whether or not these concentration camps actually accomplished what the British wanted. Did the camps bring the war to a close faster by killing Boer morale? A reason the debate still rages on is that the evidence is somewhat mixed, and I don't know enough to give you a definite opinion. Many Boer warriors could not bear it anymore to let their women and children suffer in the camps, so some Boers did surrender. But other Boers, embittered by this British cruelty, fought on. Many Boer women in the camps expected nothing less of their men, and wouldn't think of their husbands as men anymore if their men had surrendered. Yet still others suffered long months, wondering when their men would leave them and the children alone no longer to suffer in these camps. Emily Hobhouse returned to South Africa in 1905 and set up a spinning and weaving school for Boer women. She focused on expanding educational opportunities for Boer youth in Pretoria, just as German Southwest Africa opened their own concentration camps. That is the final part of this dark 3-part series on concentration camps. To give you a little update on my life, Evan, my son, just turned 8 months old. That kid still remains so endearing, so hilarious, at least to me, and most people who encounter him in the grocery store, the airport, or anywhere else that we are. He smiles constantly, laughs constantly. He's just gotten into the habit of screaming, and he really enjoys it when I play fight with him, when I take his little fists and pretend to punch my own face with them. On another note, if you want to send me any questions about these concentration camps or about the Boer Wars, if you get me enough questions using the link that I provide in the show notes, I may provide a question and answer episode. But I need a lot of questions to justify an episode like that. And finally, if you tag me in any social media posts or you share podcast episodes, you will be entered into an ongoing contest that will end in September. So feel free to tag me in any of those posts and continue sharing this show to help it go on. Thanks for listening.